hand it over to Michelle. Michelle.
Everybody, thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Michelle Stein from Protect Our Waterways, No Nuclear Waste. Protect Our Waterways is a group of concerned citizens working to protect our community from the radioactive experiment of burying nuclear waste under our water and land. We share the information that is not included in the NWMO shiny promotion packages, and we talk about the real risks involved in this experiment. The NWMO has been claiming they are looking for an informed and willing host community, yet they still haven't defined how willingness will be measured or who makes up the community. At a time when our community is in the middle of the willingness study, which has been designed to create multiple willingness indicators, in an attempt to avoid a referendum, we are left with many questions. What does willingness mean according to the NWMO? How will it be measured? Who does the NWMO consider making up the community who should decide for all of us? Who does the NWMO consider informed and able to decide? As an organization, Protect Our Waterways believes that a referendum is the only fair and true way to determine community willingness. Only by giving each and every resident the opportunity to mark their own ballot will true willingness be measured. Whether people are for or against the project, they deserve to have their choice counted. We are excited to have several presenters join us this evening. We welcome Carrie Blaze, who is a staff lawyer for Northern Ontario at the Canadian Environmental Law Association and a member of the Canadian and International Nuclear Law Association. Carrie practices energy law specific to nuclear regulation and frequently represents public interests at environmental assessment and licensing hearings before the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Ms. Blaze has also published in peer-reviewed international law texts on the topic of civil nuclear emergency preparedness and the sustainability impacts of small modular reactors. We also welcome Cassandra Eby, who is a second-year law student at the Boer-Alaskan Faculty of Law at the Lakehead University. During her first year of law school, she completed her pro bono placement with the Canadian Environmental Law Association and Environment North. During this time, she conducted legal research on the ethics and environmental justice within the context of Canada's nuclear waste storage plan in Northwestern Ontario. Cassandra's background in global health with a Master of Science from McMaster University and Honours Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto informs her research and studies in the areas of environmental health and environmental justice. John Jackson has worked for 40 years with citizen groups on a wide range of waste issues, including radioactive waste, municipal garbage, and industrial hazardous waste. This work has involved him in many siting processes. For example, the effort of an Ontario Crown agency to site a centralized industrial hazardous waste incinerator and landfill in the Niagara Peninsula. Toronto's repeated efforts to ship its garbage to municipalities throughout Ontario, and the NWMO's siting for radioactive waste. In this session, John will share with us the lessons learned from these and other siting efforts. John has taught waste management at the University of Waterloo for over 10 years. In various roles, he serves the Citizens Network on Waste Management, the Toxics-Free Great Lakes Binational Network, the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and more. John is also a member of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Water Quality Board and an advisor to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Thank you to all three of you for coming out tonight to present. And as always, a huge thank you to Bill and Bernard for organizing tonight's event.
Thank you, Michelle. And I believe we will begin tonight's presentation with Cassandra and I, who will be talking about the ethics of consent and finding a willing host. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second as I share my screen and get that all set up. And just confirming you can see my presentation.
Yeah, all good.
Perfect, thank you. So Cassandra and I are here this evening from the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and we are a legal aid clinic. We're Ontario-wide. I'm based in Northern Ontario, and I join you from the Robinson-Huron Treaty area and the traditional territory of the Nipissing First Nation. I'm a staff lawyer at CELA, And it was my honor to work with Cassandra on this project. So the two of us will be tag teaming tonight in this presentation. So CELA is a legal aid clinic, and our mandate spans direct representation of clients, providing summary advice, and also public legal education events, such as the one this evening. As a legal aid clinic, we do represent those who are low income and disproportionately exposed to environmental harms. And so today's focus, quite specifically, is around this term willing host, and as it's used by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And this term comes up because the NWMO is trying to find a location where there is some semblance of a willing host. So we're going to try to address this head on. What are the implications of this approach, and what does it mean for those who potentially may be a host? In the next 20 minutes, we're going to cover a lot of material, so hold on to your hats. So we're quickly going to review Canada's plan for the storage of nuclear waste, looking at how we got to this stage. Briefly review the roles and the jurisdictions, kind of the who's who of the siting process. Cassandra will then look at the willing host concept, both as it's used by the NWMO and also from an ethical justice lens. And then we'll conclude with some remarks around community engagement and how we can use this evening's concepts in engagement going forward. So to begin, since the coming online of Canada's nuclear power plant fleet in the approximately 1960s, Canada has been producing high-level radioactive waste. This waste is currently in interim storage close to the facilities where it was produced, so Pickering, Darlington, and Bruce. And it was in the early 2000s that the nuclear industry was building an expectation among the public, among the government, that there would be an imminent nuclear renaissance. And this was going to be driven by affordable reactor designs, cost-effective methods of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And these promises actually echo what we hear today with small modular reactors. But again, this was the early 2000s. And it was Atomic Energy of Canada Limited who formerly owned or was the designer of Canada's CANDU reactors, that they promised enhanced safety and greater efficiency of reactor designs. And in 2008, they said, yep, the world has entered a nuclear renaissance. So we now know that despite this positive rhetoric and messaging, there was no nuclear renaissance in 2008. That never occurred. However, in the lead up to that, it was recognized by the government that managing stockpiles of existing high-level radioactive waste was a barrier to this nuclear renaissance occurring. So for that reason, it was in 2002, the federal government said, okay, let's actually look at this stockpile, what will be done by industry, as it was a barrier. And in 2002, the Nuclear Fuel Management Act came out. Again, power plants had been operating since the 60s, but in 2002, the act finally came to fruition. And it was under this act, the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, which created the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, I'll call the NWMO, and they were mandated with implementing and developing a plan for managing Canada's nuclear fuel waste. It was also through this act that the federal government delegated their responsibility for implementing a strategy for long-term management of nuclear fuel to the waste producers themselves. So the responsibility for fuel waste was then given to Ontario Power Generation, OPG, AECL, Hydro-Quebec, and New Brunswick Power. And so it's within that function that the NWMO began developing a plan for the management of nuclear fuel waste. And again, set out in statute over the course of 3 years, they undertook public consultations with the public, civil society, First Nations, to look at 3 approaches to management. So from 2002 to 2005, they were tasked with reviewing 3 options. And those were 1, whether or not there should be a deep geological repository; 2, whether the storage of nuclear reactor waste should stay at reactor sites; or 3, whether above or below ground centralized storage was an option. The culmination of that, as we now know, was a recommendation for a deep geological repository. And this came out of what they called more broadly adaptive phased management. And so it was under this adaptive phased management approach that the NWMO recommended that the waste that was produced by Canada's reactors be moved away from reactor sites into centralized storage and eventually relocated to a deep geological repository. And then fast forward to 2010, that is when the NWMO began their site selection process to actually find this willing host for the deep geological repository. So that's all the background I'm going to provide tonight. I think that's sufficient. And so now we're at the stage where the NWMO is considering 2 sites for a deep geological repository. These sites are in the northwest of Ontario, near a small town called Ignace. And the second is in southern Ontario, as you know, as many of you know, in a site in the municipality of the South Bruce. Very briefly, this illustration just shows what the DGR would be comprised of, which is a series of tunnels and underground networks and rooms that are meant to contain the high-level radioactive fuel bundles, approximately 500 meters underground, measuring 2 by 3 kilometers in size. So in order to implement the NWMO's recommended waste management approach, which was adaptive phased management, they came up with a 9-step process. And we're going to look at step 5 tonight. So it's under step 5, there's a lot of text, and so don't worry about reading all of it, but it's under step 5 of this adaptive phased management approach that relates to the concept of willingness. In particular, step 5 states that it is at this stage that communities with confirmed suitable sites decide whether they are willing to accept the project and propose the terms and conditions on which the project can proceed. Within this framework, I'd also like to point out step 7. So it's at step 7, which obviously comes after step 5, the willingness decision. It's at step 7 where the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission will make its licensing decision for the project, and also where the impact assessment or environmental assessment will occur. And I just point this out as a heads up. We're not yet at step 7, but it's at this stage that the impact assessment occurs. So, you know, done well, impact assessment is a critical planning and public participation tool that allows us to question, raise, generate expert evidence and on a host of issues, from sustainability to climate change to socioeconomic effects to alternatives to the project and the purpose of the project, and really get at the core issues and the criticalness of those issues. That is happening at step 7. We're currently at step 5, which again is this willingness determination. And so unfortunately, as planned, the willingness determination by a community does come before the impact assessment stage, as currently set out. And so a short recap, just to conclude the who's who. So the NWMO, again, is mandated to develop and implement the plan for managing Canada's nuclear fuel waste. It's the CNSC that is responsible down the road for issuing a license. And it will be the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada who's responsible for conducting that impact assessment under step 7. And with that, I'm now going to pass things over to Cassandra, who is going to review how this phrase has been used specifically by the NWMO and also introduce some environmental justice and ethical frameworks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carrie. So now I'll be moving on to part 3 of the presentation. So what is a willing host according to the WMO? In step 5 of the adaptive phase management process, which Carrie just referred to, the NWMO references communities who are willing to accept, highlighted on the slide here. But what does the NWMO mean by communities, and what does willing and acceptance mean? Based on a review of NWMO resources, we found that there were various definitions provided by the NWMO, especially earlier in the process, so early to mid-2000s. For instance, NWMO acknowledged in 2004 that different individuals may have different perceptions of what willingness is to them, given their values, and accordingly, trade-offs that they're willing to make may vary individual to individual. Then we move on to 2010, where the Moving Forward Together report discusses community and willingness more thoroughly. And for instance, highlights the importance of identifying what constitutes a community and whether it should be defined narrowly and by political boundaries or based on patterns of economic activity, which would include the surrounding area. It's important to define community because it determines who will have a say in whether or not we should go forward with the high-level waste facility in the first place. Wording such as compelling demonstration of willingness also starts to appear in that same document from 2010, but what compelling means is a new question that arises. Is it a municipal vote? What about the surrounding communities or those on the transportation routes? So these are all questions that remain unaddressed. And then here you see some acknowledgement that there are a range of approaches a community may use to demonstrate its willingness in a compelling way. And you also see here a commitment to support surrounding communities. So now we jump to 2021. This is a recent and easily accessible definition by the NWMO of informed and willing host community. So it's defined as a host community, a local geographic area in which this facility is located. The community must be informed and willing to accept the project. But this easily accessible definition is quite short and broad, and questions on what each term means still remains at this stage. And it's also worth pointing out that the NWMO has committed to developing a willingness assessment plan, which is good, but there have been questions as to why this is coming so late in the process in terms of the stages that Carrie pointed out. And in this forward-looking timeline, it states that in 2023, a preferred site will be selected, but there's no mention of willingness or willing host, despite it being fundamental according to NWMO documents that you can see on the left here. So I'll now turn to my findings with regards to willingness in the literature from a more theoretical perspective to better understand where or potentially in what direction the NWMO might or should be going in defining its concept of willingness. So what we found is that there's actually limited empirical research on ethics, environmental justice, and willingness that are directly applicable to nuclear waste management in Canada. A publication in particular by Vilhunen in 2017 pointed out that more empirical research on how lay people perceive ethical issues related to community acceptance of a nuclear fuel repository is needed in order to better understand the ethical issues at the local level. The same author also observes that Canada generally has a higher level of trust in authorities and experts, but it nevertheless remains really important to understand the justice and ethical issues at hand, particularly given the risks of a local community inherently trusting the engagement process without questioning it relative to other countries. And I'll also point out that we did do a search of legal case law, and there are no legal definitions of willing host or similar concepts specific to high-level waste in the legal case law. So according to the NWMO, its process of identifying a site was underpinned by values that Canadians said are important. So different options were evaluated, and 8 objectives were determined in terms of those values. So fairness, public health and safety, worker health and safety, community well-being. These were all determined to be core values for the process. However, a peer-reviewed publication by Ramana in 2013 found that the process of trying to find a community to host a repository has not highlighted the importance of ascertaining those values. Instead, it's mostly involved a promise of jobs and other economic benefits in front of those potential communities. So whether or not NWMO is ascertaining to their set values is important in ensuring that the communities and broader society are able to be that final arbiter of safety throughout the whole process. In the literature, various ethical frameworks and justice principles have also been identified as potential guidance for communities when discussing whether or not they are truly willing. So they're all listed here. They're all different theoretical frameworks to kind of guide you. So first, there's this concept of nuclear stigma. So residents worrying that the project will sully the name of their community and have an effect on its reputation. That's been shown throughout the literature to significantly impact willingness of a community. Then there's the concept of nuclear oasis. So the power relationship between location, industry, and society, how geographical remoteness, political powerlessness can lead to a culture of acceptance, increasing the willingness and acceptance of a community. Then we have this concept of regional justice. So in Canada, regional injustices arise. For example, if Southern Canada produces a disproportionate amount of nuclear waste while the North is focused on the future repository of it. So that's an example of a regional injustice that could arise. And then the last three, coercion and consent, the perception of a benefit, compensation, is there compensation being given to a community for living next to the radioactive waste site? That can potentially influence the willingness as well. And then the community's perception of justice. What is justice to the two communities from their perspective? So for my last slide, looking ahead, there's a few areas that need attention or require answers going forward. So first, the NWMO's references to willingness and community have gradually decreased in their reports. Preliminary questions proposed in earlier reports from the early and mid 2000s do remain unaddressed, those questions that I pointed out at the beginning. Second, it's interesting to note the various ethical frameworks and justice principles that can be used as guidance for communities when discussing whether or not they are truly willing. And then third, communities can rely on ethical frameworks to question impacts on their rights, on justice, on equity, and whether threshold of willingness has truly been met. So these are three things to consider moving forward. And now we'll go back to Carrie to conclude our portion of the webinar.
Thanks, Cassandra. And I know there'll be a Q&A after, and I'll just share our contact info. If you do wish to contact us beyond this webinar, you're more than welcome to. And with that, I will conclude and pass things over to John.
I think I'm coming through here. Just give me a second here. Yes, okay.
Yep, you're good to go, John.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you for that great presentations before us. And I'm going to talk a bit more specifically about some of the experience with informed consent or the various things that we call it. And you know, as you've already heard, there are a lot of different terms that are used, and NWMO has gotten to the point now of calling it informed and willing host community. I always am startled when I see some of the language that's used here, and it isn't just NWMO. All proponents do this. Like host community, it sounds like you're going to be the one that gives the big party when you win it. And you're going to be the wonderful host, and you're such a lucky outfit. And so often they have the terms of candidate sites, and it sounds like you're in the great race to get there and win the final, like you're at the Olympics, you're still a candidate. And this manipulation of language is so common throughout all these citing processes, and it really is very manipulative and unacceptable. We're in a situation now, as we were just told, that this hasn't been clarified, how they're going to define informed and willing host, how that's going to be shown, how consent is shown. And it's absolutely insane that we're this far down the road and the communities that they are looking at do not know how that decision will be made around what consent is. know, some of us on this call, Renee for sure, I know, we were on workshops back in 2009 with NWMO developing this and came up with a very clear direction, which of course they've ignored. They probably weren't thrilled with, and it wasn't just environmental groups, it was a range of types of people, probably weren't that thrilled with what you had to say. So now we're in this situation where the municipalities, you know, the Ignace and South Bruce are trying to figure that out and doing a survey in the community to try to figure out what that means. But this is very dubious in nature. There's a couple of fundamental flaws. It's based on the idea of figuring out how will the municipality make the decision about whether there is consent. It's not how the people will make that decision. It's still the implication somehow that that's the municipality that's going to make the decision. And that just is not appropriate. Another fundamental flaw is that NWMO has never made a clear commitment by saying it directly that if we don't get your consent, we will leave. And that's it. And in all the other processes, I'll give you some examples from Alberta and Manitoba tonight, but the one that people here are probably most well acquainted with was the agreement between OPG and the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation that the DGR1, if that community voted against it, that was the end of it, and OPG would leave and look elsewhere and look for a different type of solution. NWMO has never made that commitment to the community. It's sort of implied, but we can't accept it as being just in an implied situation. So how do you determine willingness? And I should have flipped ahead to that, that slide sooner. That summarizes what I just already said. And of course, in both communities, in Northwestern Ontario, people are out there very clearly saying, no, we're not into this. Here's South Bruce very clearly saying, we're not, you know, not willing to host. Renee, I don't know, on what I'm seeing, part of the slides are covered by the lineup of speakers on the side. It's all showing, and it wasn't showing from what I saw before with when Carrie was talking.
I think that might just be you as a presenter, John, because my screen shows you and your full slide.
Okay, I won't worry about it then. There's a couple of factors in terms of the approval of a site. And the first one is, just because a community consents, that doesn't mean that it's okay to go there. It still must pass a strict environmental and health test. And I'll give you an example. When the province of Manitoba was looking for a site for industrial hazardous waste, Pinawa was out there saying, we want to be the site. We want to be the site. And Manitoba said, no way. We're not going to put a hazardous waste up there in that rock. That's just, we won't do it. But of course, you have to realize Pinawa was home of White Shell Laboratories, nuclear engineers, etc., who have this confidence that we can engineer anything. But that is absolutely critical, that it doesn't matter whether there's consent or not, you have to pass very strict environmental and health tests. And the concerned citizens have a major role in pushing to make sure that that criticism is happening, to make sure that that test is strict and hard, and that the opposing views are being brought forward. So then the second factor, which is passing the voluntary or willing host test. So I break that into two parts. One is, are you informed? And two, do you consent? And as you all know, the proponent presents an incredibly one-sided, very biased, incomplete information. It's often really a public relations exercise, and all of you know that. You're all experiencing it so much. There was a CNSC hearing that I listened to parts of just at the beginning of June this year, where the proponents said in the hearing, after the Indigenous community complained that they asked for documents and they weren't sent the whole documents. And the response they gave was, we consider that we need to release only that which will be helpful to the public. Only will release what the public needs. The proponent should not and does not get to decide what you need. And we have to keep on top of that, but that's what they try to push for. To give you another example of how the one-sidedness, the Ontario Waste Management Corporation, this was the industrial hazardous waste site that was proposed for the Niagara Peninsula for the entire province and beyond, which after a long struggle, we managed to defeat. They went for 5 years with a document that their own consultants had prepared that showed that their hazardous waste landfill would permanently contaminate groundwater under 3,000 acres of farmland beyond their property. This is, we finally, after 5 years, kept digging and digging. There just something seemed to be wrong there, and finally got it to come out right within a month of the end of the hearings. And the site here, you see, this is where their landfill site would be. The contamination, chloride contamination, a lot of hazardous chemicals in it, was going to go out under all this farmland. All this was hidden from us, down to the Welland River. And the only reason it stops at the Welland River is that it goes into the Welland River and then over to Niagara River and up over the falls into Lake Ontario. But that was just ignored. And so that sort of thing is what comes out and what we have to all keep digging to make sure that that sort of stuff happens. Then the other thing, and I'll be very brief on this one because it was already raised, is what's the timing of whether you're adequately informed? And it's very clear that in this one, as was pointed out by Carrie earlier, that the test of consent happens before the environmental assessment hearings, before you've had the opportunity at the hearings to hear the information, to have the critical examination and the cross-examination of witnesses, to be able to bring forward your critical information and present your own case in a very public way for everyone to hear. And in the UNWM case, that's all going to happen after you've agreed. You don't have the information you need. You cannot be informed at that stage. So the NWMO cannot pass the informed component of this system because they plan to require final decision by the community consent before the hearings even start. Completely unacceptable. The other thing that's really important is the role of the critics in informing the community, the role of you in informing the community. It isn't just NWMO. We know that the flaws in terms of manipulation and et cetera. And municipalities rarely, and certainly in these cases, are not playing the role of critics. So standard are just reinforce what the proponent is already saying, reinforce the information and spread it, but they don't become critics. It's really rare. I've seen a couple of instances where they have, but it's really rare. So we have to be out there bringing forward, all the research that we can do, all the persistence that we can do, pointing out the flaws. And the example I gave you of the OWMC example, that hearing would have passed. That thing would have been built. It would have been contaminating the community, except for the persistence of citizens in getting the critics' document, the government's documents, because it was a government agency, the documents out. So we have to use a wide range of mechanisms, and we're never sure which is the piece of information that may be the critical one that makes the difference. So don't feel you should just have to focus in on one thing. You're not sure which is the one that really will make the difference. So you need to explore all of those and bring them out. So then how do you determine consent? When to make the decision? I won't go into that again. We just discussed it. Who makes the decision? That's a really important question. How is the decision made? And if we're looking at which I'm going to be recommending, I know we're all urging a referendum type of thing, what percentage has to agree for it to be seen as valid? Who makes the consent decision? It really has to be done by a binding referendum where everyone has the opportunity to vote. We have to be careful in terms of the timing and the methods of doing that, tailored to the community you're in. For example, if there are seasonal residents, and as there are in both of these communities, that they have the opportunity also to be involved. The other example is a farm community. Bad time to hold a referendum is when it's seeding time or harvesting time, when a lot of people in that community simply cannot make the sacrifice of being immersed in that, and to avoid that and make sure that the proponent avoids that. Frequently, proponents aren't stupid. Frequently, they try to do some of the critical stuff at the time when critical people are away, or at a time when much of the community is heavily immersed in having to deal with the pressing things to save themselves for that year. A municipal council is not capable of giving consent. They're capable of it, but not legitimately of giving consent. Because the reality is, when the municipal council got voted in, they weren't voted in simply on the basis of that one issue. There are a ton of other issues going on that you're going to be dealing with over the years. And you can't say that that council has the right to claim that they represent the public on this issue. So that should be off the table immediately. The other mechanism that you see in the ideas that NWMO puts out, and that you see in the documents that the two municipalities are putting out as options, you can't do polling. Polling is only a sampling of the community, where everyone doesn't get to give their view. A referendum lets everybody speak. And the example that a lot of you so well know is the DGR proposal, the low to mid-level DGR proposal, where they did a telephone poll and said, oh yes, we have community consent. 72% people that we telephoned said it was okay. But when you looked at it and saw how many people they actually contacted, et cetera, they actually had probably around 13% only of the support. So polling is just automatically has to be off the table. So which communities need to be included? And it's really important here that any one of these communities does not consent, the site should be dropped. Indigenous communities, of course, in whose traditional territories may be, harvesting areas that the proposed facility would be sited in. And today there is more attention being paid to that. I must remember back when the Seaborn hearing was happening, and Brene will remember this with humor in some sense, but ironic humor, is that at the hearing, the OPG came forward with a map of Northern Ontario saying, we will not put it within a certain number of kilometers of communities. And I can't remember the number of kilometers that it was. It's not that important at this point. And we looked at the map. The Aboriginal communities, the Indigenous communities, the Native communities were not on the map. They weren't the communities they were considering about. That was insanity, but it shows how off base it could get. So the other thing then is people in the municipality or unorganized community where the site is. And it's important I've used the word people in the municipality, not the municipality, not the municipal council. And that has to be a wide range of communities. Some of these are places where The place that's called the municipality, Ignace, for example, is 42 kilometers from where their site is. They're not the host community, as much as I hate to use that term. We had a situation where Toronto was going to send its waste up to Northern Ontario. It's garbage, send it by train up to Northern Ontario. And it was called like Kirkland Lake. That's was like where it was going. No, it wasn't in Kirkland Lake. It was in Boston Township. So that's really important to make sure that that isn't allowed to happen. The other thing you have to look at is adjacent communities. I'm going to show you a map here. This is when the province of Alberta were doing their siting process, and they held referendums in 2 communities, both of which voted in favor of it. They were both were in the high 70% saying they would consent. And in many ways, the community of Riley was much better from a transportation perspective. It was much closer to both Calgary and Edmonton. But the province decided we're sending it Swan Hills instead, which was much further north. The reason they gave, very important. Up here was where the site would be. This is the municipality that got to vote. Then you look here, almost all the population is living down here. You can see all the names of the streets, etc. And the people in the surrounding municipalities had no opportunity to vote. And the province said, I think we blew this. And so they dropped this site. That's a really important lesson for all of us. So adjacent communities must be included. And then, of course, communities downstream, both from a groundwater perspective and a surface water perspective. The Adams Mine proposal back again to send you up to Kirkland Lake. The communities that were going to be potentially negatively affected were the ones downstream from the site, not Kirkland Lake. And the farms and so on, they were the ones who would have had the real negative impact. So we have to include those. And finally, communities along the transportation routes need to be also doing it. So all of these communities need to consent, not just one. So what percent vote do you need? The Alberta case, 79% voted in favor of the site. And the second one, the Riley one, was 77%. So they were basically equal. You look at others, Hamiota and Rossburn, which are 2 communities in Manitoba, where the province was looking at bearing industrial hazardous waste, voluntary process again. In both communities, these were 2 sites. In both communities, voted around 67% opposed to the site. And Manitoba, true to its word, immediately said, okay, that's it. And we appreciate the time you've given us, etc. But we will move on true to our word. Another one was Deep River. And this was for radioactive waste, low-level radioactive waste. 72% voted for it. But again, it ended up not happening because the contract that the municipality made with the federal government was that they would guarantee them a certain number of maintenance of the existing federal jobs in Deep River, again, related to nuclear issues. And when the federal government started cutting its budgets very quickly after that, Deep River said, you've broken the contract, we're out of here. Generally, what practitioners say is that consent should not be considered as given unless more than 70% of the people who voted say we consent. The reason it isn't a simple 51% is we are dealing here with an issue that is forever. So we vote in a municipal council, 51%, they can do a fair bit of damage, for example, if they were able to approve consent to this proposal, but you can vote them out in a few years. Once we've got that facility in our community, voting it out, big deal. We've got that damage there forever. And therefore, you find it among the practitioners. I'm not just talking about critics here, but the people who actually run these willing host processes. They consider if you don't have at least 70% consent, you don't have consent. And therefore, you're going to run into endless problems. It just won't work. The other questions in voluntarism, I'll be very quick on these, is this again, the effect of employment and cash promises. The goodies that you'll get, and they range, the open wallet approach it's called, where not only do you promise, the employment from there, but in addition, and the cash is already being handed out to the municipality and to groups in the community, to really just kind of divert it. And the horrible thing that comes out of this is that what it does is it diverts the attention, it diverts the debate in the community about whether the proposal would be safe and environmentally acceptable or not to, hey, is the goodies package good enough? So to have that thrown into the debate, and it happens basically all the time, has this horrible impact of changing the debate about whether we think this is safe or not to what do we think we can get out of it. Another critical problem is the campaign fair when you get to the referendum stage. There's NWMO and all the other proponents that have spent years campaigning. They get to that stage of doing the so-called education, it's their campaign, around the time of the referendum with limitless amounts of money and access to all kinds of media and so on. It's really critical that we be prepared and that campaign be underway now. And I know it is in both of these communities as you're educating your community. And it's critical to be doing that. One of the things to me that is just most heartbreaking is the effects I've seen of the campaign on communities. I don't just mean the campaign, but the whole searching process, what does the community think of it and so on. One of the most heartbreaking I was in was the Hamiota and Rossbourne that I told you about. And I visited both of those communities and spoke in both of those communities just not long before they held the referendums. And they were heartbreaking, but the communities have become internally divided. I remember the development commissioner for the municipality standing up, and he was almost in tears. He said, I have worked for 5 years to find something to come in here to provide us with employment. And now finally I found one, and you're telling me you don't want it. And of course, there were some that did want it. But that sort of dividing of the community is just horrendous. And I think that it's really important that we make sure that the proponent is aware that is not acceptable. The final thing, of course, is what about the voice for the future generations? The communities I gave you, they're not, the future generation isn't there getting to vote. And we have to make sure we put the really highest priority, especially with something like radionuclides, of making sure that we're taking into account the needs of all life far, far into the distant future. How do we make sure this is in people's minds when they vote in the referendum, that they're thinking about the long-term future, not just the next 20 years, but the hundreds of years, thousands of years? The final thing I want to say is that, we get put into the situation of being defined as the problem. These people who just won't listen to reason, these people who refuse to accept the waste. Never forget, the problem is the waste. It's not us. We are the ones that are trying to make sure the waste get dealt with properly. And that is what the problem is, not the waste. But it so often gets tossed onto us as if we are the problem, we're unreasonable, etc. The critical thing to remember in all of this is that if we refuse it, and this is the idea behind consent process, is that what the proponent needs to do after that, or the government, or whoever needs to do after that, is not go look for another community, not go and try to find if there's a way, if they open the wallet wider, they might be persuade us to change, but to say, wait a minute, if we can't find a community that's willing to accept the solution we're looking at, we must have the wrong solution. And therefore, we have to look at new ways of dealing with the waste, look at alternative ways of dealing with the waste, not be looking at how do we persuade a community to accept it. So I leave it at that. I look forward to the discussion. If you wish to contact me, don't hesitate, and I'll pass it on to, I'm not sure who's stepping in at this point. Is it Bill? Are you stepping in at this point?
Great. Thanks very much, John. Excellent presentations from both Carrie and Cassandra and from John. We've got a lively discussion going on in the chat right now. We're going to move to the Q&A section. Carrie has been answering some of those as we go, but we've got a number lined up, and I'll, as is my habit, I'll assign them somewhat arbitrarily. I'll try to match them to the speakers, but somewhat arbitrarily. We'll come back and revisit some of those that Carrie has answered in written form. First question I'm going to actually hand to you, John. A question from Sylvia. The willing host, could that be related to water taking by private water bottling? John, do you see any parallels there between water takings and the lack of community consent around water takings?
Yeah, I think we're talking about this in terms of waste. There are a ton of issues, ton of environmental issues, and not just environmental issues, where community consent, I think, is also really important. So I think water takings should well be applied as well.
Great, thanks. I'm going to hand this question to, I'll let you decide, Carrie and Cassandra, who wants to answer, but it's a question from David, and the background is around polls outside of South Bruce done by Bruce Power and submitted to the local community papers. They're indicating favorable support of the concept of a DGR in Bruce and Grey counties. The question is it ethical for the NWMO to identify those polls as a willingness indicator in regards to the regional community? So Bruce Power is actually not one of the member companies of Nuclear Waste Management Organization, because Ontario Power Generation, Bruce Power generates the waste, Ontario Power Generation owns the waste, but they are one of the waste generators in the area. So the question is, what are the ethics around the NWMO relying on polls done by the industry in the area that have a kind of a promotional flavor? Carrie and Cassandra?
Excellent question. Cassandra, you're welcome to jump in as well. Only to say that with any survey, any polling data, you have to always question the source. Who conducted it? Was it independent? And what were the questions that were asked? And there's people who actually specialize in surveys. And so I would encourage you to definitely look into what makes actually a valuable survey. And when statements or polls like that are put out, I would call them on their actions. And so the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission actually will use similar statements. They'll say Canadians support new nuclear, Canadians support new small modular reactors. And when they say statements like that, I then email and say, can I please have the source for that statement? Upon which they will say, oh, it was the Canadian Nuclear Association, an industry body, and they did a poll and they did a survey and we're just releasing that data. And again, you have to push back on that because it's not independent. It's not done by a third party. It is very much a vested interest that's being reflected. So when that comes up, call them on it.
Great. Cassandra, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, and I think that without the concept of willingness even being defined in the first place, it is a bit of a skewed statistic. So without those preliminary definitions of willingness and community, it's misleading to state something like that. So that's why it's so important to have those definitions early on.
Great, thank you.
Renee, just one quick on that, and what's critical in the agreement that has been made of what is going to be considered consent is that includes not just the method, the things, say it be the referendum, but that it has to be at least this percentage saying, at least the 70 or whatever it is, saying that they agree. Because you don't want the debate to happen on that after you've had the vote and 55% said, yeah, we agree. And then it just becomes an out for the proponent. So that agreement of if it isn't at least this high, you're gone by. And that has to be well in advance of the referendum happening.
Great, thank you, John. And that's a good segue into the next question, which I'm going to ask you to comment on first, John, although certainly invite Carrie and Cassandra to join in. It starts with a question and then goes to a comment, but I'll ask you to maybe comment on both. So it's a question from Sheila 2. We've got 2 Sheilas signed up with the same name. So Sheila 2 comments, in the big picture, does it really matter what the community wants? If the community is determined willing by referendum or some other means, will everyone else respect that and stop opposing the project? If the community is determined unwilling, does the government and the NWMO walk away from the idea? And then the comment is that there should be some guarantees that the results of local willingness should be respected, including by those who don't agree or who don't live here. So John, any comment on that?
Well, on both of those, right at the beginning, I said the flaw in the NWMO one is they are not clearly saying that if we don't get consent, we'll leave. And every other time I've seen a proponent talking about voluntary siting process, they have very clearly articulated over and over, if we don't get consent, we leave and we won't be back. And not saying in a petty way. I mean, that's the commitment we make to you, and we leave. NWMO has avoided saying that, and that is a huge problem. And the other thing again was, yes, the 51% is a disaster, and proponents have come to realize that too. That if they've only got 51% in acceptance in the community for a particular proposal, they know they're in for a really rough ride. It's far from being over. And that's why you hear practitioners constantly say it's got to be at least a 70%. And that doesn't guarantee you're not going to still have problems. Your mute must be on, Bernine.
Our next question is actually from David, and it's a comment to Sheila 2, I presume. So I think we'll just leave that as a chat. I'm going to follow up again with you, John. There's a comment from Anne clarifying that there is a written agreement between Saugeen Ojibwe Nation and the NWMO that SON must consent again. Similar to, it's an agreement similar to one between OPG and Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. Is there a sense that NWMO would not abide as OPG did so far? So John, maybe if you could comment on that again, Sandra, and comment on perhaps both the sites.
Yeah, no, and I gave the example of OPG with SON and then stepping away as they had promised. I didn't realize that they had such an agreement with NWMO as well. But that's what everyone needs. Even if SON decide to vote in favor of it, I have no idea how they may vote. If the other communities don't, if they say no, that also should have that same power, that commitment that we leave. And I'm not seeing that commitment from NWMO. I'm glad they've got it with SON and they've gotten that. The other communities need that commitment as well.
Including, I'll just note from the Northwest, there is no similar commitment that is at least of public knowledge between NWMO and either Treaty 3 or any of the Treaty 3 communities in the vicinity of the site. Carrie or Cassandra, did you want to add to that?
No, I think John covered it quite well. Thanks.
Good. And I think we've got a repeat question from Sheila 2. around willingness and the opposition. We'll go to a question from Nisha. If the Anishinaabe Nation in Northwestern Ontario did not consent, will they close shop as they did in other traditional territories, Ojibwe Nation of Saugeen, Savant Lake? So I think what Nisha is asking, the Ojibwe Nation, so the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation in Bruce County area, Bruce and Grey County. There's also a Ojibwe Nation of Saugeen 258 at Savant Lake is just north of the site in Northwestern Ontario. So I think Nisha is just adding detail to the question around consent, commitment to consent from First Nations in other territories. So I don't know if any of our speakers would like to comment on that.
Can I suggest that I don't speak to that, but can I suggest that Carrie speak to that? I mean, the issue of, it's different because SON has a specific agreement that says they will leave, but the consent in terms of all the other EA processes that are going on across the country isn't that clear. Carrie?
Yeah, that's a great segue, John. So in the context of Indigenous law, the courts have not yet recognized consent. And by that, I mean, there is a constitutional duty to consult First Nation communities, but that consultation has not yet risen to the threshold of requiring consent. Where we're getting close is with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's in that UN document that we have the free, prior, informed consent principle. And I think that principle, even though it originates in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is highly relevant in this context. So the principle is free, prior, informed consent. Free meaning it's free from coercion, it's free from conflicts of interest. Informed meaning the knowledge was there. You're not seeking consent without that information, hence the word informed, being there first. And Canada has, in the Indigenous context, has committed to UNDRIP, the UN Declaration, and Canada is also implementing its own domestic law that says we are going to implement UNDRIP within how we apply our laws domestically. All that means is we will now apply that as an interpretive lens when conducting consultation with Indigenous communities. Consent doesn't provide a veto, it doesn't provide that right. So that isn't currently on the table. Consent hasn't risen to that level yet. So it totally is an interpretive mechanism at this stage, highly relevant, not to be diminished. But I would also encourage everyone to be thinking of this as the free, prior, informed consent principle, not just consent on its own.
Thank you, Carrie. And we have a question. NWMO told us, this is a participant from the Dryden area in Northwestern Ontario. NWMO told us in Dryden that they only had to get willingness from Ignace and Wabigoon Lake Ojibwe Nation. So this is a question around there are a number of different First Nations in the area, and Wabigoon is one, and is the one that NWMO has been most engaged with, perhaps. I don't know if Carrie or Cassandra would comment on that. It's similar, I think, to what you've just covered, Carrie.
It is similar, and also I think it goes back to Cassandra's point around community. What's community? Has it been defined? Is it geographic? Is it political? Is it watershed based? Is it Ontarians? And again, without that being defined, how can you just pinpoint two communities versus a larger expanse?
Yeah, and I'll just add that I know Jody was doing a lot of research and work on the transportation routes, and those big hubs and cities along the transportation that may be at risk. Do they have a say? What is NWMO doing about those specific communities? So it's unclear. It's still unclear. It's not listed anywhere what a community is at this point.
Great. Thank you. And we have a question from Susan, which I think is going to allow us to expand on that lack of clarity. Susan's participating from New Brunswick. She comments that the waste in New Brunswick is in Point Lepreau. And if the DGR project went ahead, the waste would need to travel through half of New Brunswick, through many small communities, just to reach the Quebec border, then through Quebec, then Eastern Ontario, northeastern Ontario to northwestern Ontario or to southwestern Ontario. How would consent work in New Brunswick? Question was to John, but I'll invite all panelists to comment.
Please invite all panelists to comment. No, it's very complicated, Susan. I totally understand, but the transportation routes somehow have to be involved in this because they can be at real risk. I don't know them how best to do that mechanism, but I think that needs to be sorted out. I hope someone else has some great idea how to do it.
I wish I had some solution, but again, just another consideration to take into account. Right now, this is the willingness determination, and I think it's really important to expand who is eligible to weigh in on that willingness determination. It should be New Brunswick. It should be everyone who lives along that transport corridor, and not just Ignace or South Bruce, as NWMO would prefer. The second aspect is, remember, further down the road, there will be a federal environmental assessment, now goes under the name of impact assessment. Within that impact assessment, it will be critical when the government is looking to define what is the project. Is it a DGR? No, it's a DGR plus the transport route. There'll have to be another wave of public outreach to ensure the project that's being reviewed for the impact assessment is the project in its most holistic, cumulative sense.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Question, I think this one for you, Carrie. Can the percentage of a referendum be changed from 51% by the municipality, or are there any laws already in place for this? So John is making a very good argument that the measure of consent of willingness needs to be at least 70%. If the municipality was to add a referendum, say to the fall 2022 election, is there a mechanism to require a 70% pass?
Great question. So unless there's like a bylaw municipally that states it must be 51%, I don't think that's a hard and fast rule right now. Oh, John, yeah, go for it.
This is why you have to make sure it's not done as an official municipal referendum, because there is clear provincial legislation that says referendums are not binding unless at least 50% of the populace votes, and if 51% vote in favor. So you don't want this to be an official municipal referendum. This is a referendum being done for the NWMO. And so that's the only way you get around that. Because don't make it a legal municipal referendum, because you can get stuck.
Great, thank you. A question from David, and I think this is probably for all of our panelists. The NWMO said before making a 2023 decision, it requires both an informed and a willing host. It's not an option to South Bruce to declare that we are not fully is it not an option for South Bruce to declare that we're not fully informed, either by way of a full EA, as well as the socioeconomic impacts of this project, which are rarely addressed by the NWMO? So is that how would our panelists respond to that? John, we'll begin with you and then go to Carrie.
Sure, because I certainly made the point that I think you have every basis to be able to say you're not informed if they're asking you to make the decision at that stage. Whether you win that or not, I doubt, I will have ask Carrie and Cassandra answer. I don't know that there's a legal basis to be able to make that argument, but there certainly is an incredibly strong moral basis, and a basis that just generally makes sense to the public, makes sense to politicians, is the fact that, hey, we haven't heard most of the stuff yet. We haven't heard it. This can't be considered real informed until that's happened. I don't know if there's any legal way to deal with it, but I'll pass it over to Carrie and Cassandra.
Likewise, there's no legal hook to say that's binding or contractual. It has persuasive value if a community can be deemed willing. However, that said, yeah, I'm just looking at your question again, David. Again, it has to go back to the very premise of was there willingness, was there a definition, was there community? I know we're repeating ourselves, but I think those are the fundamental questions. And then I think beyond the legal hooks, we can't overlook the social license to operate. There's the license the CNSC will grant. There's the EA, the Impact Assessment Agency, will grant or deny. But there's the social license piece to that. And that piece is critical because that's usually where projects get held up. And the social license is that ethical stage. It's within those questions of, is it just, has it been ethical, was there coercion, was there a conflict of interest? And that's actually where a lot of decisions on major developments and major projects occurs, is within the social licensing phase, which again is in the public's court.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. Carrie, I'm going to ask you to revisit a question from Kyla, which you answered in writing. Kyla asked around the definition of willingness. Is there an aspect, clause, or conflict of interest from what she's seen in the local area? A lot of the ads from the NWMO, but they're one-sided and biased by Kyla's assessment. And she's wondering about conflict of interest in terms of ensuring informed consent. So Carrie, maybe if you could share briefly your response that you already provided, which was excellent. And then John, if you want to comment as well.
Sure. So Cassandra was able to dig up a number of excellent resources. So if you want to read further on this, definitely check out the resources that we've popped into the Q&A box. So absolutely, if it's one-sided, if it's biased, if it's not independent, that questions the integrity of any decision that's being made. And if the integrity of that decision, in this case being willingness, is questioned, it again, was it ethical? Was it just? And if there were elements of coercion, if there were elements of conflict of interest, then again, there is nothing binding within the decision that can come from that. Yeah, and Cassandra, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think it goes back to those ethical frameworks, right? And the importance of the community being aware of these frameworks in the first place, to kind of have a good understanding of their rights going forward and being able to advocate for themselves as the process moves forward, and just knowing what to look out for. Yeah, that's all I'd add.
Great. Thanks very much. And we've had Anne add in the Q&A, there had been a question back to Anne around timing of the SON, Saugeen Ojibwe Nation decision-making. And Anne just adds that she can't recall from what the SON NWMO letter says on timing, but she thinks they can intervene at any point. And we'll add that, we'll send out a follow-up email and we'll add the link to that SON NWMO letter when we send that out. So I think that we are through our question and answer, which is excellent. Wonderful, wonderful job by our panelists. And I think at this point, seeing no further questions in the queue, John, you want to add something?
Yeah, can I just make one overall comment? Is that it's your persistence that matters, that makes all the difference. People living in this community and your partners and friends and everything else is the persistence. It's a long thing. It isn't over quickly, but they count on you getting burnt out. They count on you sort of just, oh, this is hopeless. It's the persistence. You have to keep your spirits up, and people will need a break at a time during it, the farm or a health condition or something. And to step in at that point and give them the break and help them out and fill the role that they may have been filling. So it's really important to be taking care of yourselves and your community, but remembering that it is persistent, that you have a lot of other allies out there to connect with beyond your communities, and making those connections is really important. So I know they're hard, basic struggles, but communities I've talked with who've been involved in this and have been part of, they always say, boy, we're glad we did it, even though they never wanted to be in it. And I get so frustrated with proponents of not realizing what they have done to communities, even if they do end up leaving because of the disruption in life. But that's that's the commitment you've made because you realize what it can mean to the future. You're on mute again, Brene.
I know it. Carrie or Cassandra, did you want to add any additional comment before we hand the microphone over to Bill?
I think you're on mute again, Renee.
Bill, over to you.
Okay, fine. Well, first of all, I want to thank these presentations tonight were very interesting, informative, provocative, stimulated a lot of questions, raised a lot of questions from a point of view that we don't have answers to. So we really appreciate the fact that you took the time to enlighten us in some regards relative to the struggle, but also to some of the issues that are around this whole question of nuclear waste. I saw some of the comments that in the chat that the fact is that it's the people that are the problem and not the project. Well, if the project didn't exist, there wouldn't be a division within the community. So it cannot be the people. And it's always interesting to learn about other locations that have experienced similar kind of issues in dealing with waste of any kind. And the fact is that it is a problem for us in both communities to make sure that the people, at the end of the day, it is the people that got to live with the problem or the future, whatever it might be, from a point of view of ongoing. It is not our council. It's not, the NWMO. It's not the nuclear industry. It's the community that has to live with it forever. And I think John made that point earlier, that it is really a forever decision. So we've got to think about what's the future hold. There was also some questions in the chat about, well, the DGR is the solution. It's the best solution that we have. Well, the DGR is a 50-year-old idea, and I think it's outdated. And we need to do more researching in the idea of how to manage waste in different ways. And while we do that, we need to wait to make this decision. There is no need to rush into this decision at this point in the whole issue of nuclear waste. It's been around for 70 years. And what's the difference if it lasts another 20 years where it is currently stored and we look at other solutions? So I again thank the speakers for a very informative, heartbreaking kind of emotion that you could see in the chat. And this is a very, very serious issue for all of the community residents that are involved with this. And it's a shame that such small communities have to make this decision kind of in isolation of the whole province, the whole issue. So it's really forcing such a tremendous issue and the problem onto communities that really haven't benefited that much from the whole aspect of nuclear energy. So anyway, I just want to say thank you again. And Renee, thank you again for the great job you always do. And I'll say good night for now, and I'll keep going with some future webinars. And thank you for everyone that participated tonight. I know it's time consuming, but the only way you can actually learn something is to participate in the discussion. And that's what this is all about. It's trying to bring out discussion, because without discussion, you have conflict. And you need to make sure that people respect other people's opinions. And I know for a fact I do. And it's something that we all have to think about. And when we make statements that are not complimentary to your neighbor, then, you know, that's not something you should be proud of. So let's all make sure that we can work together in this whole issue of trying to sort out the nuclear waste issue for our communities and for, I guess, the nuclear industry in general. So again, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Bill. And thank you all and good night.